The last thing my father-in-law said to me before the police walked through my front door was, "You have no idea what you're doing to this family." He was standing in my kitchen, holding a mug of coffee like it was still an ordinary Tuesday morning, like the folder of forged documents sitting on my kitchen table wasn't real, like the $214,000 missing from my son's trust account didn't exist, like I hadn't spent the last 4 months quietly, carefully, building the case that was about to end his life as he knew it. I set my hands flat on the table and looked at him. I wasn't shaking. That surprised me more than anything else. "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said. Then the doorbell rang. "My name is Claire. I'm 32 years old. I work part-time at a rehabilitation clinic, helping patients relearn how to walk after strokes, after accidents, after the kind of sudden losses that rearrange a life without warning. I know what recovery looks like. I know it's slow and it's unglamorous and it doesn't happen in a straight line." I thought I understood grief the same way. I didn't understand anything yet. My husband died 8 months before all of this, a Tuesday evening in October. A driver who ran a red light on Route 9 and never had to answer for it the way my husband did. He was 34. He coached Little League on weekends. He made terrible coffee and he knew it and he kept making it anyway. And I would give almost anything to pour one of those bad cups down the sink right now. We had a son together. He was 4 when his father died. Old enough to ask where Daddy was. Young enough that someday the memory would blur at the edges and I would have to be the one who kept it sharp. The weeks after the funeral were the hardest thing I've ever lived through. Not because of the grief, though that was its own weight. Because of everything the grief sat on top of. The life insurance paperwork, the joint accounts that needed to be separated, the hospital bills that kept arriving like they hadn't heard the news. My husband had been the one who managed most of our finances. Not because I couldn't, but because we had divided things the way couples do, each person taking half the invisible labor of a shared life, and his half included the spreadsheets. My father-in-law stepped in within 2 weeks of the burial. He was at the door with groceries the first time, and I let him in because I was holding my son on one hip and a stack of unopened mail in my other hand, and I didn't have enough hands for the door. He put the groceries away while I read through a letter from our insurance provider. When I looked up, he had already started a pot of soup. "You shouldn't have to deal with all of this alone," he said. He had a calm voice, the kind of voice people use at funerals and in waiting rooms. "Let me help you figure out the finances." Marcus was handling all of it. "You need someone who knows how these accounts are structured." My husband's name was Marcus. His father's name was also Marcus. They had laughed about that when we first started dating. The kind of family joke I thought was charming once. I was exhausted and I was grateful, and I said yes. That was the first mistake, not the last. The help looked legitimate at first. He came by twice a week. He sat with me at the kitchen table and walked me through the accounts, the insurance claim, the paperwork required to access my husband's retirement fund. He was methodical. He spoke in solutions the same way the financial advisors do on television, steady and assured, and like the answer was always just one more signature away. My son liked him, called him Pop Pop. Ryan to the door when he heard the car in the driveway. That mattered to me more than it should have. I was watching my child lose something irreplaceable, and here was a piece of his father still walking around in the world, still showing up. I didn't want to look too hard at anything that made my son smile. 3 months in, my father-in-law suggested consolidating the accounts. He framed it as simplification. Fewer logins, fewer statements, fewer things for me to track when I was already stretched thin. He said he could be a joint signatory on one account just to help manage the estate until everything was fully settled. Temporary, he said, just until the legal side cleared up. I was working 4 days a week and raising a 4-year-old and sleeping maybe 5 hours a night. Temporary sounded reasonable. I signed. The first thing I noticed was how tired I started feeling. Not the ordinary tired of grief and single parenthood. Something heavier, a fog that settled in by early afternoon and didn't lift until I'd slept. I chalked it up to stress. My doctor chalked it up to stress. My father-in-law chalked it up to stress and handed me a bottle of supplements he said had helped his wife after a difficult period years ago. Magnesium, he said. Good to know. For sleep. Natural. I took them every morning because I was tired and because they were sitting right there on the counter and because I trusted him. I want to sit with that sentence for a moment. Because I trusted him. It's not a stupid thing to trust someone. It's not weakness. He was my husband's father. He had photographs of my husband as a child on the walls of his house. He had held my son at the hospital the day he was born. The people who hurt us most are rarely strangers. They are almost always people who already had a key to something. 4 months after I signed the joint account paperwork, I got a call from my bank about unusual activity. I almost missed it. My father-in-law had been managing the mail, sorting what needed attention from what was routine, and the statement with the account balance had been going to a secondary email he had set up on my behalf when he was, he said, helping me organize everything digitally. But the call came directly to my cell phone. A representative named Dana, voice careful and practiced. She asked if I had authorized a series of transfers. I said I didn't understand the question. She read me the amounts. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not because my legs gave out, because the floor was the closest surface. My son was at preschool. The house was quiet. I sat on the tile in my work scrubs and listened to Dana list 6 transfers over 14 weeks. The total was a number I couldn't immediately absorb. I said I needed to call her back. I didn't call her back. Not right away. I opened my laptop and I looked at every account I could access and I started writing numbers on the back of an envelope because I needed to see them to believe them. The trust account my husband had established for our son before he died, funded by a portion of the life insurance payout and meant to cover our son's education, had been accessed 4 times. The transfers listed a secondary account I didn't recognize. My hands were steady. That was the part I didn't expect. I had cried so many times in the previous months that I think I had temporarily run out of whatever produces tears. What replaced it was something colder and more useful. I put the envelope in my coat pocket. I closed my laptop. I made a sandwich for when my son came home. And I started paying attention. The difference between reacting and observing is harder to hold on to than it sounds. Every instinct I had wanted to confront him immediately, wanted to call him from the kitchen floor and demand an explanation. But I had watched enough patience in recovery to know that rushing a process before it was ready to hold weight only undoes the work. You have to build before you can test the structure. So I didn't say anything. I watched instead. I watched the way he handled paperwork when he visited, how quickly certain documents moved from the table to his bag, always with a smooth explanation. Filing these, he'd say, keeping things organized. I watched how he poured his own coffee before offering mine, and how the supplements were always already sitting out when he arrived, positioned closer to my side of the counter than his. I watched how he answered questions I hadn't asked yet, filling space before I could move into it. I called Dana back from my car, parked 2 blocks from my house, engine running. She told me the secondary account the transfers had gone into was registered to a business entity in a state I had never visited. She gave me the reference number for the fraud investigation she had already opened. She told me to photograph everything and not to move any money myself. I thanked her. I sat in the car for a while after we hung up. Then I drove to a hardware store and bought the smallest wireless camera they had in stock. I set it up in the kitchen, behind a row of cookbooks I never used, angled toward the counter where the paperwork usually lived. I told myself I might not see anything. I told myself maybe there was an explanation I hadn't thought of yet. I am a fair person. I wanted to be fair. What the camera recorded over the following 9 days ended any fairness I had left. The second night, I watched him arrive while I was putting my son down for a nap. I hadn't heard him come in because he had a key. Had always had a key since the early weeks when he was helping me get groceries, and I was too broken to argue logistics. On the footage, he moved through the kitchen with the comfort of someone who had done this many times before. He went directly to the drawer where I kept the household files. He pulled a folder. He photographed several pages with his phone. He replaced the folder exactly as he'd found it. Then he put the kettle on and called out, asking if I wanted tea. I heard myself answer from down the hall, "Yes, please." I watched this footage alone in my bedroom at 11 o'clock at night with the door closed and my son asleep 6 feet away. I watched it 3 times. Then I took a screenshot of the timestamp and the angle and sent it to the email address I had set up from a new account 2 days before under a name that wasn't mine. A woman named Renata had given me that email address. I found her through a support group someone had linked in a comment on a post I'd made in a widow's forum. The post had been vague, something about feeling confused by financial paperwork and not sure who to trust. Renata had messaged privately. She didn't ask many questions. She just sent me a list of resources and at the bottom an address for a nonprofit that helps survivors of financial abuse navigate documentation and legal processes. I hadn't used the word survivor yet. I wasn't ready for it. But I saved the address. The day I finally went, I told my father-in-law I had a dentist appointment. He offered to watch my son. I said my neighbor would do it. He looked mildly surprised, the way people do when a door they expected to be open is quietly closed. I smiled and I left. The woman at the nonprofit was named Georgette. She had an office that smelled like old coffee, and she spoke with the precision of someone who had heard many versions of this story and understood exactly which details mattered. I put my envelope on her desk. I put the folder of account statements I had quietly made copies of. I put a USB drive with the camera footage. She looked at everything slowly and without expression. Then she looked at me. "How long have you been documenting?" she said. "3 weeks," I said. She nodded. "We need more. But this is a solid start." Over the following 6 weeks, Georgette connected me with a financial crimes investigator, a family law attorney who worked on a sliding scale, and 2 other women whose stories had moved through the same pattern I was living. Different relationships, different amounts, identical architecture. A person enters during vulnerability, takes over logistics, controls information, isolates, extracts. One of the women told me something I have thought about almost every day since. She said, "He's not confused about what he's doing. He just thinks he's smarter than you." That landed somewhere specific. Because my father-in-law was smart, he had been careful. But he had also become comfortable, and comfort makes people careless. He had stopped checking whether I was still the same woman I'd been 3 months ago. He had decided I was manageable. He was wrong about that. The attorney found the business entity the transfers had gone into. It had been registered 4 months before my husband died. She said that without hesitation, watching my face while she said it, and I sat very still and let the full shape of that settle in. 4 months before. This had been planned while my husband was still alive. While we were still a family sitting at the same table, eating dinner and making plans and talking about whether we'd go to Maine that summer or Savannah. I excused myself and went to the bathroom and stood at the sink with the cold water running for a long time. When I came back, I said, "What do we do next?" She told me. The plan required patience I had to manufacture every single day. My father-in-law came to the house twice a week, and I made him coffee, and I answered his questions, and I let him believe the version of me he had decided was real. Grieving, overwhelmed, grateful. Every time he handed me the supplements, I said thank you and put them in my pocket and flushed them when he left, because by that point I had enough reason to not want whatever was in them. A lab had tested a sample Georgette's contact had arranged. The results were not dramatic, but they were not nothing either. Low doses, consistent enough to sustain confusion, not enough to leave obvious marks. I told my father-in-law I was sleeping better. He seemed pleased. The thing that finally broke open the full picture wasn't the account transfers or the camera footage or the supplements. It was a document his own attorney had filed incorrectly in probate court. A petition to modify the terms of my son's trust that listed my father-in-law as the intended primary trustee, following what the filing described as the beneficiary's mother's demonstrated difficulty managing complex financial decisions. My attorney flagged it on a Friday afternoon. I was at work when she called. I stepped outside into the parking lot and stood between 2 cars and listened to her explain it. And for the first time in 6 weeks, I felt the full weight of what I had been living inside. He had been building a paper trail, using my fog, my signatures, my exhaustion to construct a documented history of incompetence, so that when he finally moved to take formal legal control, there would be a record showing I had needed help all along. He had been constructing the story in advance of telling it. I called Georgette from the same parking lot. She said 4 words: "We move this week." The investigators came to my house on a Thursday morning. I had told my father-in-law I needed help sorting through some of my husband's paperwork, and he arrived at 9 o'clock with his own folder, tucked under his arm, unhurried, almost cheerful. He had good color in his face. He had slept well, probably. He thought he was close to the end of this. He walked into my kitchen and I was already at the table. The folder was already open in front of me. The camera footage was already queued on my laptop. The account statements were already arranged in date order. He looked at the table and then he looked at me, and something shifted in his expression so quickly it was almost invisible. Almost. "What's all this?" he said. I said, "Sit down." He didn't sit. He put his own folder on the counter and crossed his arms and started talking. It came out smooth, the way it always did. There had been a miscommunication. He had been trying to protect the assets during an unstable period. He was family. He was the one who had been there when no one else was. Did I understand what he had sacrificed? Did I understand how much he had given up to help me? I let him talk. I had learned from watching him that people reveal the most when they think they're still in control of the narrative. When he finished, I turned to the laptop to face him. He watched maybe 40 seconds of the kitchen footage before he stopped talking. Then the doorbell rang. He turned toward the hallway, turned back to me. Something had drained from his face and hadn't been replaced by anything. "Claire," he started. "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said. I walked to the door and opened it myself. The investigator from the Financial Crimes Unit was a woman named Officer Tran, compact and unhurried, with a partner who took up most of the doorframe behind her. 2 others followed. They had paperwork. They were respectful and they were thorough, and they moved through my house with the calm efficiency of people who have done this many times and understand that doing it correctly matters more than doing it dramatically. My father-in-law tried to speak to them in the kitchen for several minutes. The same voice he used for everything: reasonable, authoritative, prepared with explanations. Officer Tran listened with the expression of someone reading a document in a language they know very well. She did not look impressed. She did not look moved. She looked like a person whose job is to follow evidence, and the evidence was arranged on my kitchen table in date order. When they led him out through the front door, he looked back at me from the porch. His eyes were sharp in a way I had never seen before. Not angry. Something more precise than anger. The look of someone recalculating. I held his gaze and didn't step back. My son was at preschool. I had arranged that deliberately. Some things a child doesn't need to see. There would be enough to explain later in age-appropriate pieces over years. I had thought about that too. The house was very quiet after they left. I sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the folder still lying open in front of me, and I let myself feel, for about 4 minutes, the full extent of what I had been carrying. The weight of performing okayness while running a parallel investigation in the margins of my life. The exhaustion of being meticulous when grief had already taken everything extra I had. The specific loneliness of not being able to tell anyone because I couldn't risk him knowing. Then I closed the folder and I called my sister for the first time in 4 months, and she picked up on the second ring and I said, "I need to tell you something." The legal process moved with the particular grinding consistency of systems built for accuracy rather than speed. There were hearings, there were depositions, there were months of documentation review, but the shape of it held. The transfers had totaled $214,000. The business entity he had used was traced to 2 previous transactions in another state, neither of which had ever been reported because the women involved had not known what they were looking at. Now they did. Each of them filed separately. The cases were linked. The probate court petition to modify my son's trust was denied and then used as additional evidence of intent. My attorney described it as an unusually clean paper trail for a case like this. I told her he had been careless because he thought I was too blurry around the edges to read clearly. She said that happened a lot. Predators confuse a target's grief for a target's intelligence. My son's trust was fully restored by court order. Every dollar. The estate attorney found an additional account I hadn't known existed, funded before my husband's death and intended for exactly this possibility. My husband's handwriting in the margin of the original document, in a note to me he must have written sometime in the year before he died. in the quiet way of a man who had thought carefully about what he was leaving behind. I read that note alone in my car in the parking lot of the law office, and I cried for the first time in months. Not from grief this time. From something that didn't have a clean name yet. Gratitude, maybe. The particular tenderness of being loved by someone who is no longer there to see it land. The supplements were addressed in a civil component of the case. Nothing rose to the level of criminal poisoning. The doses were too low and the product technically available commercially, but the pattern of behavior was documented in detail. My doctor wrote a statement. The lab results were filed. My attorney said it added meaningful weight to the overall picture of intent. He entered a plea agreement 8 months after the morning he sat in my kitchen and watched his plan disassemble in front of him. 4 years, with the possibility of parole at 2.5. Full restitution ordered. Professional licenses and estate management he had been operating under were permanently revoked. I wasn't in the courtroom for the sentencing. I had thought I wanted to be. In the end, I didn't need it. The outcome didn't live in that room. It lived in my house, which felt like my house again for the first time in over a year. In my son, who was starting kindergarten that fall and who had begun sleeping through the night. In the account balance I could look at without a cold feeling moving up through my chest. My mother-in-law, who had been estranged from her ex-husband for years and who I had barely known, called me after the plea was entered. We talked for 2 hours. She said she was not surprised. She said she was sorry it had taken something like this for us to speak. I said I was sorry too. We have dinner together sometimes now, the 3 of us. My son calls her Grandma Elaine, and she tears up every time. I went back to full-time hours at the clinic in the spring. The work is the same as it always was, incremental and slow, and occasionally very beautiful. Watching someone walk across a room they couldn't cross 6 weeks ago is one of the finest things I have ever seen. You don't get tired of it. I started keeping a private record of my experience, not for any specific purpose at first, just because writing had helped me think when everything was most unclear. Over time, Georgette suggested I might talk to women who were earlier in similar situations. She said my documentation process had been unusually thorough for someone without legal training, and that seeing how I'd approached it might help others understand that they could also approach it systematically, that being in the middle of grief did not mean being unable to think. I started attending a monthly meeting at the nonprofit. I don't lead it. I sit in a corner and I drink the bad coffee and I listen, and when someone asks me how I knew what to do, I tell them the truth. I didn't know. I started with 1 camera and 1 envelope and 1 phone call, and then the next thing, and then the next. You build the path by walking. I am not a particularly brave person. I don't think bravery is the right word for any of this. Brave implies a choice between courage and fear, and mostly what I felt for 8 months was just the absolute necessity of continuing to move forward because my son was watching and because the alternative was unacceptable. My husband kept a terrible photograph of the 2 of us on his side of the dresser for the entirety of our marriage. A beach photo from our first summer together, both of us squinting into direct sunlight, neither of us looking at the camera. I kept it in a box for the first year after he died because I couldn't have it in my line of sight every morning without coming apart. It's back on the dresser now. When my son asks me about his father, I tell him the true things, that he was kind, that he was funny and he made terrible coffee and he coached Little League and he thought carefully about what he was leaving behind, that he loved him more than he will probably ever understand. I tell him that too, that love is not always loud. Sometimes it is a note in a margin. Sometimes it is a camera on a shelf. Sometimes it is just continuing to stand in the same place, very still until the people who wanted you to disappear realize you are not going to. If you have ever sat with paperwork you didn't understand, signatures you were pressured into, and a feeling in your stomach that something was wrong even before you could name what it was, you weren't imagining it. You never were. The confusion is not a flaw in you. It is the design. And designs can be read once you know what you're looking at. You know what you're looking at. If this story felt familiar in any part of your life, leave it in the comments. Someone there might need to read exactly what you write. Hit subscribe so you're there when the next one comes, because these stories don't stop mattering just because they're hard to say.